This is the third and final video that I'm going to do based on three appendices at the end of my book, Metal Ropes, which is about how to apply techniques of the Deadball Era from over 100 years ago to our era of aluminum or alloy bats. And of course that carries on into how the game is played in professional ball with a wooden bat. But I think there are some lessons you can learn from way, way back. However, I know that many of you probably are not sold on spreading the hands like Ty Cobb, or you don't want to take the little hop before your stroke like Tris Speaker. There are going to be some things that I just can't convince you would help you, especially if you're a small guy. I think these are good ways to hit for a high average, hit low line drives, but there are also ways that are more contemporary that where you can work in some of these other techniques. So I did one appendix C in my book I dedicated to Ted Williams, and of course he has the classic stroke where the very smooth swing where you rock back, and then I think I went forward a little more than he would like. This is more or less contemporary with Ted Williams. What I call the crouch and thrust stroke dealt with in Appendix B. I used Johnny Mize as my exemplar there, and I called that the crouch and thrust, where you get out on the rear foot and you might take a little stride, but you're spread out. I should have my bat more like this. And then you distinctly stay back and try to get what we called a launch angle today. They didn't call it that back then, but that was the same idea. You're supposed to elevate the ball. Duke Snider, Mickey Mantle, those guys had that uppercut swing, certainly Willie McCovey. Now, when I was making that video about Appendix B, I realized that I was kind of leaching into Appendix C of the book, which is dedicated to Charley Lau. Charley, in a way, if you think about it, is almost splicing in those 40s and 50s and pretty much through the 60s hitting styles into something that is a bit of a throwback to the Deadball Era. Charley and his protege, Walt Hriniak, H-R-I-N-I-A-K, I don't know if I could win a Polish spelling bee, but I remember how to spell his name. But anyway, those two guys had a lot of very successful products through the White Sox and the Red Sox. And I guess Charley started with the Kansas City Royals. George Brett worked with him. In fact, George is on practically every other page of The Art of Hitting 300, Charley's great book. But Charley and Walt seemed to me to have kind of brought back the forward weight shift, which was definitely something professional coaches were de-emphasizing after World War II. They don't necessarily talk about this very openly, but I remember that Dwight Evans especially, Walt worked with a lot of Red Sox hitters like Dwight Evans and Bill Buckner and Wade Boggs to some extent. Rich Gedman, but I remember Dwight he'd have that finish where it looked so uncomfortable and awkward. He'd finish swinging at the ball, and he's supposed to have his head trailing the ball into the catcher's mitt. I think the idea there, although again Walt and Charley I don't think they were fully aware of this, but I think what they were trying to get at is you can shift your weight forward. It's okay. Why else would you be doing that with your head, except it's kind of an indirect way of emphasizing a forward weight shift. If you're doing the old school swing that we've talked about so much at smallballsuccess.com, if you're coming off that back foot entirely, there's no way that you can do what is the great Achilles heel of the Ted Williams swing, where you fly open and pull your head off the ball. With the full forward weight transfer, you keep your head down and on the ball, and I think Charley and Walt were kind of rediscovering that. Now, their swing, I mentioned Dwight Evans, Dewey Evans, and on the White Sox, we had Tim Raines, after he came over from Montreal. Robin Ventura, this is my favorite bat. It's a 35-inch Robin Ventura. So many hitters, Ozzie Guillen, I remember the 80s and those guys, Carlton Fisk, of course, White Sox, and then Red Sox. Those guys modeled so many aspects of that swing. But I think Billy Buckner is one of the ones that, especially, he was my favorite, always will be one of my favorite hitters. I think he should be in the Hall of Fame. He just gets brutally penalized for one bad play in an extra inning World Series game that he shouldn't even have been in because he didn't have any knees left, and the Red Sox blew the 7th game anyway, although they had the lead. And let's just blame all that on Billy. Anyway, no more of that. But here's the classic sort of Bill Buckner. I'm going to do it from the right side because my left heel is bothering me so much right now. But this is the Charley Lau, Walt Hriniak approach. Again, you have your feet spread out, and if you see a hitter, maybe in an old video, with the bat in one hand and he's kind of pointing it at the pitcher, then he brings it back and cradles it loosely in his top hand, his backhand, and gets into a crouch. This is Tim Raines, very much Tim Raines as well. And there's almost no stride. This pumping, it's like the crouch and thrust again, except your weight is going forward. This is your stride, essentially. And I really like this. I think you could certainly do this. If I had to hit right-handed, which I don't do very much, but if I were called upon to do it in a pinch, I would be very tempted to do something like that. It's a very level swing, as you can tell. It's a lot of times Walt and Charley would have their hitters, they didn't force them to do this, but it was kind of part of the method. They would have the hitters release with the top hand. And indeed, that became kind of, I think, the most distinguishing characteristic. If you mention Lau and Hriniak, that's probably the one thing that most hitting instructors remember, that you had the release of the hand. And I don't see why that has to be a necessity. I mean, if you get an outside pitch or an off-speed pitch that's out there and you're a little early, why not release the top hand and just go after it and kind of chase it to the opposite field? But if it's on the inside, I would think you'd want your top hand to be on the bat to really drive the barrel through. So I don't see why you couldn't do both of those. I think that's kind of a ridiculous thing to place all of the emphasis on. So you can do both of these, and you have to spread out. But I can do that on an outside pitch. And I can do that on an inside pitch. It was said that by Ted Williams and others that, of course, Ted was kind of my way or the highway guy. When Hriniak was coaching with the Red Sox, Ted wasn't too happy about what he saw as a loss of power among the Red Sox hitters. And it's been said that you do lose power. And I guess maybe you kind of do if the top hand is coming off the bat and not driving all the way through with it. I think, again, it depends on your technique, but if your feet are spread out wide, it does seem to me that you're going to lose some power. Frank Thomas, when he was on the White Sox, certainly picked up a lot from this method, but of course Frank had his feet pretty close together. he always had that release of the top hand, that early release. But he was so tall and powerful, and he didn't have his feet spread out. So no one would ever say that Frank Thomas suffered from a power deficit. It's not necessarily going to cost you power. If I had one thing as a dad that I could redo, because this is the method that I taught my little guy when he was growing up, I think if I could change one thing about this, I would have the feet closer together. Because now I wasn't concerned about power in the case of my son. I wanted him to be an on-base guy, and I knew he wasn't likely to be the biggest kid on the field. But I feel that the mistake that I made was in thinking that your hands are going to be quicker when you put all of the emphasis on your hands. If your feet are spread out and you're really doing nothing with the lower body but just thrusting the hands forward a little bit with it, then it seems like that would be the quickest swing, because you've already taken your stride essentially as soon as you set up in the box. But I no longer think that that's true. In my work with dead ball hitters, I'm really convinced that if you have an active lower body, and especially if you're, say, taking a little hop to get ready, that extra energy that you put into the swing with your lower body is going to translate into an accelerated barrel. If you take your lower body out of it, for the most part, then your barrel's going to slow down. Doesn't matter how much emphasis you put on your hands. Guys like Carew and Tony Fernandez, they were really fine hitters, but they were not, they were average hit for average guys, certainly. Carew was terrific, but didn't hit with much power and hit to the opposite field a lot. That's all good too, but I think you could hit for more power, and with today's fast pitching too, I think you'd maybe stand a better chance of success having a more active lower body. So that's why in small ball success I'm still kind of favoring the old school swing with more active footwork. If you do that, naturally your timing has to be pretty much perfect. And I guess you could say finally about the Charley Lau stroke that for guys who are having trouble with timing, it does take the footwork pretty much out of the equation, so that you can, in Rod Carew fashion, or Wade Boggs, or Tony Gwynn, you can put so much emphasis on the hands that maybe the timing problem goes away. As long as you don't mind just poking at the ball and lobbing it to the opposite field, it's a basic good method. Why don't you try it if you're completely struggling? Try Charley Lau, and maybe you can build off of that once you get more confident.